Alright, picture this. 1859, a time when the world was a very different place. The gold rush was in full swing, and the American Civil War was just around the corner. But our story takes us to a quieter, yet equally dramatic setting. The San Juan Islands, nestled between what's now Washington State and Canada. A picturesque archipelago, seemingly serene, but hiding a brewing storm. Back then, utter wilderness. Trees everywhere, salmon leaping. The islands were a natural paradise, untouched by the hustle and bustle of modern life. International disputes over pig ownership, surprisingly common. You see, pigs were valuable assets, and their ownership could spark serious disagreements. Our story begins with a humble pig. Not just any pig, but one that would become the catalyst for an international incident. A rootin', tootin', potato-loving fella. This pig had a particular fondness for potatoes, which would soon lead to trouble. This pig, sadly lacking in GPS capabilities, decides to go for a wander. A wander that would take him far from home and into the annals of history. A wander that takes him directly into the garden of one grumpy Brit, Lyman Cutler. Lyman was a settler who had little patience for intruders, especially porcine ones. Now Lyman, he wasn't known for his patience. He was a man of action, quick to defend his territory. Maybe it was the island life. Maybe he just hated pigs. Or perhaps it was the frustration of living in such a remote place. Whatever the reason, when he saw that pig munching on his precious potatoes, well, let's just say things escalated quickly. Whatever the reason, when he saw that pig munching on his precious potatoes, well, let's just say things escalated quickly. Lyman grabbed his rifle, and with a single shot, the pig's fate was sealed. Bang! One shot, and our unfortunate porker became international news. This wasn't just a simple case of a farmer protecting his crops. You see, this wasn't just any pig. This pig belonged to a British subject, and its untimely demise would spark a much larger conflict. This was a pig in the wrong place at the wrong time. Smack dab in the middle of a simmering border dispute between the United States and Great Britain. This was a pig in the wrong place at the wrong time. Smack dab in the middle of a simmering border dispute between the United States and Great Britain. The tension had been building for years, and this incident was the spark that could ignite a war. You know, just your typical neighbourly disagreement, except with potential for global conflict. What started as a simple act of trespassing quickly escalated into a full-blown international incident. The San Juan Islands. Sounds idyllic, right? Nestled between the mainland United States and Vancouver Island, these islands are a picturesque paradise of natural beauty and tranquility. Problem was, both the US and Britain thought they owned the whole shebang. This wasn't just a minor misunderstanding, it was a full-blown territorial dispute. It all stemmed from a poorly worded treaty way back when. The Treaty of Oregon, signed in 1846, was supposed to settle the boundary issues, but it left a lot to be desired in terms of clarity. You know how these things go. Ambiguities in legal documents can lead to all sorts of complications, and this was no exception. Americans, fresh off their manifest destiny, better anything, figured the islands were basically theirs. They saw it as their right, almost a divine mandate, to expand westward and claim new territories. The British, with their fancy tea parties and global empire, weren't so keen on budging either. They had their own interests to protect and weren't about to let go of what they considered rightfully theirs. So, they did what any sensible nations would do, sent a bunch of guys with guns to sort it out. Military presence on both sides escalated the situation. You had American settlers, like our pal Lyman, chopping wood, planting potatoes, and generally trying to live their lives. They were just trying to make a living in this contested land. Then, you had the British, all prim and proper in their uniforms, doing very British things, like building forts and drinking tea. Their disciplined approach contrasted sharply with the rugged American settlers. It was a recipe for, well, let's just say things were a tad tense, even before the pig incident. The atmosphere was charged, and it wouldn't take much to ignite a full-blown conflict. And then, of course, there was the pig incident. Word got back to the American authorities that one of their citizens had been wronged. Not just wronged, but wronged. This wasn't just about potatoes anymore. This was about national pride, freedom, the pursuit of happiness, and maybe a little bit about a tasty breakfast sausage. The British, for their part, were all Well, he eating our subjects' potatoes. See, they weren't actually that bothered about the pig. They were bothered about the principle of the thing. And maybe a little bit about not wanting to look weak in front of the Americans. Suddenly, everyone's sending telegrams, Washington's fuming, London's muttering about the audacity of these colonists. Newspapers are having a field day. It's the talk of the taverns. It's the 1859 equivalent of going viral, only with fewer cat videos and more threats of military action. Now, you might think this is where cooler heads prevail. You might think someone steps in, shakes everyone's hand and says, "Look, it's just a pig. Let's not start World War Z over this." You would be wrong. Both sides, caught up in the frenzy, decided the best course of action was to send in the troops. The Americans, in a truly American display of go big or go home, dispatched a whopping 500 soldiers. The British, perhaps realising the absurdity of it all, sent a slightly more modest contingent. For the next 13 years, the two armies basically had a standoff. They built forts, glared at each other from across the island, and probably played a lot of cards. The only casualties? Time and, one assumes, a fair amount of facial hair. Thankfully, somewhere in the midst of all this military posturing, sanity prevailed. Both sides realised that a full-blown war over a pig-turned-potato thief was, well, a bit daft. Enter the diplomats, stage left, carrying briefcases and probably a healthy dose of antacids. These weren't your average, stuffy diplomats though. The British sent a bloke named Richard Pakenham, a smooth-talking charmer known for his wit, and, more importantly, his love of a good time. The Americans countered with their own diplomatic rock star, General Winfield Scott. Scott was a bit of a character, a stickler for protocol, but also a fan of lavish parties and, according to some, a bit of a drama queen. Their mission? De-escalate the situation, preferably without anyone losing face or, starting a war. Their strategy? A series of increasingly lavish dinners, diplomatic back and forth, and a surprising amount of shared laughter. Now, here's where things get really interesting. See, General Scott, he had a secret weapon up his sleeve. Oysters. Delicious, succulent, Pacific Northwest oysters. Word on the diplomatic street was that Pakenham, despite being British, had a bit of a soft spot for these tasty bivalves. So, Scott did what any good host would do. He laid on a feast. We're talking oysters on the half shell, oysters Rockefeller, oysters grilled, fried, and probably even turned into a delicious oyster ice cream. The Emperor himself, Napoleon III of France, even got involved, sending over a renowned chef to prepare the feast. The idea was simple: win over Pakenham's stomach, and maybe, just maybe, you could win over his diplomatic sensibilities. It was a long shot, but hey, when you're trying to prevent a war over a pig, sometimes you gotta get creative. Did the oysters work their magic? Well, we may never know for sure. The historical records are a bit murky, and the details of that fateful dinner are lost to time. But what we do know is that Pakenham and Scott, fueled by good food, good wine, and probably a shared desire to avoid a pointless war, managed to hammer out a compromise. The atmosphere must have been tense, yet the conviviality of the meal likely helped to break the ice. It wasn't exactly pretty. The agreement was hastily written and full of ambiguities. Both sides agreed to jointly occupy the island until a final decision could be made. This temporary solution allowed both nations to save face while avoiding immediate conflict. But it was a far cry from the all-out war that had seemed so imminent just a few weeks earlier. The threat of bloodshed had been averted, at least for the time being. And hey, if it took a few dozen oysters and a French chef to get there, well, that's a small price to pay for peace, right? The culinary diplomacy had worked wonders. The joint occupation lasted another 13 years, but thankfully, things remained relatively peaceful. The soldiers on both sides learned to coexist, if not exactly as friends, then at least as non-enemies. The soldiers, tired of glaring at each other, mostly kept to themselves. They found ways to pass the time, playing cards and sharing stories. There were a few minor incidents, sure, but nothing that couldn't be solved with a stiff drink and a reminder that, at the end of the day, it was all about a pig. The absurdity of the situation often brought a wry smile to their faces. Finally, in 1872, the pig war, as it had come to be known, officially came to an end. An international arbitration, led by Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany, yes, really, awarded the disputed islands to the United States. The British, perhaps relieved to finally be rid of the whole ordeal, packed up their teacups and headed home. And so, the San Juan Islands became part of Washington state. The pig, sadly, did not get a statue erected in its honour, though some might argue it deserved one. But its legacy lived on, a reminder that even the silliest of disputes can have surprisingly significant consequences. The pig war may seem like a footnote in history, a quirky anecdote to be trotted out at parties, but it holds some surprisingly relevant lessons, even today. It reminds us that diplomacy, however messy and oyster-filled, is always preferable to war. It teaches us that sometimes a sense of humour and a willingness to share a good meal can go a long way. And perhaps, most importantly, it reminds us that even the smallest of sparks, be it a pig with a taste for potatoes or a poorly worded treaty, can ignite a firestorm. So, the next time you're feeling tempted to get into an argument, take a deep breath, remember the pig war, and maybe just order a pizza instead. You never know, it might just save the world.